Habiba Kande is a writer, historian, erotologist, and former student at Al-Azhar. He is the author of numerous books, such as Illuminating the Blackness, Blacks and African Muslims in Brazil, Kunyaza, The Secret of Female Pleasure, and A Taste of Honey, Sexuality and Erotology in Islam. And because he's one of the very rare men talking about the struggles of Muslim men in modern societies, I wanted to talk to him about the Muslim Redpill passport bros, but also sexual literacy in our communities, and what can we do to fix things as spouses, as friends, or as parents. I wanted to talk about the passport bros, and the obvious question for someone who is not native to the UK and a bit an outsider to all these debates is, why Morocco in the first place?
Good question. Shall we first define what we mean by passport bros?
Let's do that, yeah.
Not many people might be familiar. So passport bros, I think it started in the US, maybe the last 20 to 30 years, where a number of Americans would travel to different parts of the world to meet their wife or to have casual sexual encounters. A lot of passport bros travel for sexual tourism. And again, like I said, started in the US, it carried on to parts of Europe as well, and also amongst Muslims as well. But with the Muslim passport bros, Muslims travel to Muslim majority countries such as Morocco, sometimes Indonesia, sometimes Malaysia, sometimes to find a wife, and oftentimes in order to have casual sexual encounters. So that's where like the Muslim passport bros phenomenon kind of comes about.
Why specifically Morocco out of all of the places?
Yeah, Morocco is a fascinating one because for whatever reason, a number of Muslims, particularly Muslims from South Asia and some parts of West Africa as well, Moroccan women is put on a pedestal. Like Moroccan women are highly fetishized. They're seen as like the best of both worlds because they're considered to be Arab, even though most Moroccans I think are Berber. So they're considered to have the best of both worlds, being Arab, but also being close enough to Europe. And a lot of their features are quite European. So for a lot of number of brothers, not only again South Asian brothers, West African brothers as well, for whatever reason, Morocco is like the ideal woman in terms of the ideal wife. Even when I was in Egypt, to be fair, like Morocco was, again, a lot of brothers from different parts of the world. And it upset some of my Moroccan friends because they felt like a number of non-Moroccans were speaking about their women in an objectified manner and kind of disrespecting them. But also what I did find when I was in Egypt is that Moroccans have a bad reputation amongst Arabs because unfortunately, a lot of Moroccans are considered to be, they're quite liberal in terms of sexual relations, especially compared to a number of Arab countries. And prostitution obviously exists in all parts of the world, but because it's known that a number of Arabs, wealthy men from the Gulf, would travel to Morocco for sexual tourism and to sleep with prostitutes, a lot of Moroccans have a negative reputation. So much so that even in Saudi Arabia, I think it was in 2010, a number of Moroccan women were prohibited from coming to Saudi for Umrah because under the guise that they thought they were coming for prostitution. So again, Morocco is one of those countries that it fascinates, but also it's one which is often maligned and marginalized by some Muslims for different reasons. So they've got, in some parts of the world, a very positive, they're highly desired, and other parts they're demonized. And I've got a number of Moroccan friends myself, and this is something they've always kind of like irritated them as well, like the way Moroccan women and unfortunately are perceived.
But it wouldn't cross the mind of these passport bros to just go to France, because you have lots of Moroccan women in France as well.
Do you know the reason why they go to Morocco? I think because Moroccans from Morocco are considered to be more traditional and more affordable. So there's Moroccans in the UK, there's a lot of Moroccans in Ladbroke Grove. They're not the target because they're considered to be westernized, or they've been so-called corrupted by feminism, so to speak. But they'll like to go to find a traditional wife, which they think they'll find in Morocco, who is a virgin, who is young, who's going to be completely obedient and submissive to them. Now, in reality, a lot of Moroccan women are not like that. You know, they're independent, they're not as docile as what's made out to believe, but a number of men who have been to Morocco, and what happens is that men who have been to Morocco, they might have had relations with prostitutes, and then they exaggerate their experiences and they talk about these women as wives, or some men who have married a Moroccan wife they will talk about obviously their experiences, and then that's why a lot of men, particularly like in the UK and also some parts of America, will just fantasize about going to Morocco, because again it's affordable in terms of they can house them, they can, even if the woman is staying in Morocco, and they can fly back from their country, and because they're Arabic speaking, obviously the Arabic, they've got a dialect which isn't as, it's quite far away from classical Arabic, but it's still Arab enough for them to see that this like an Arab girl. And again, the beauty as well. Morocco, a lot of Moroccan women obviously are extremely beautiful. So it's kind of seen as the best of both worlds, that you've got the looks of a model, and then you've got the piety of like a sahabiya. That's how some brothers frame it. Again, a lot of it's unrealistic, the expectations, but this is like the dream for a number of Muslim passport bros. But they wouldn't even call themselves passport bros, because a number of them would say that we're going there for wives. And even those who are going there for sexual tourism, many of them wouldn't admit it. It's kind of like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Like, we know what we're going there for.
Even in our town, here in Surrey, we know it's public knowledge. We have a lot of uncles who are on the mosque committee, but at the same time have very questionable behaviors towards women. And we've tons of stories, people stealing money from people for these purposes. And I remember a few months ago, I believe there was a scandal in Leicester about this woman renting out an Airbnb, which was used as a brothel for prostitution. And she recognized a lot of older men, younger men from her Muslim community using these services. Why do you think this is happening?
Because men want casual sex. They want sex. If we're going to be honest, it's not all men, of course, but the men that are engaging in those services, they want sex without commitment. They want sex without responsibility. Now, of course, a number of people might be surprised, because many of them are Muslim. Many of them come from cultures which teach and say that you can't have sex outside of marriage. So that's why, again, a lot of it is done underground. But the issue of sex tourism or prostitution, men paying for sex, it's not new within the Muslim community. It's not new in Islamic history. Many people think it is. We know, of course, the religion prohibits prostitution and sex outside of marriage, but Muslims have been having sex outside of marriage for hundreds of years. It's not a new phenomenon. What is really peculiar, from my understanding of seeing some of these scandals, is people will try and justify it in the name of the religion. But in terms of men engaging in prostitution, that's not new. It's been happening, like I said, for hundreds of years. So Muslims shouldn't be, even like in Bangladesh, prostitution, I heard, is legal. So people shouldn't be surprised that there are some Muslims engaging in prostitution. Where I think is more shocking is, like I said, when people will try and use the religion to justify sexual misbehavior. And oftentimes where people go to, maybe like countries like Morocco, Egypt, Malaysia, it's done under the guise of what is known as a misyar marriage, or a marriage with the intention of divorce. And because some Muslim scholars consider those types of marital arrangements to be legally valid from a technical perspective, even though they're clearly unethical and immoral, some Muslims will exploit these religious rulings to go and engage in these, way beyond objectionable practices. Like it's a form of sexual exploitation. But again, it's something which, obviously, being a Muslim, being born and bred in the UK, I've spent some time abroad, I'm well aware of these practices, but I just wasn't aware that how people would, like I said, use the religion to try and justify some of these more than questionable behaviour.
Why are people not just being honest? Because I'm asking from the perspective of someone who was Muslim in France, where you have at the same time, people who do pimping, who are like drug dealers, but there is no pretense of being like super religious. If someone like deals drugs, is into crime, because I was around these people, they're going to be honest, I know this is not what I'm supposed to do. I should go to the mosque and stop this, but I don't have any other way out. Why people here in the UK are not similarly honest about just, I want to have sex, I want women easily, I don't want to commit, I'm just going to do it.
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's something that I've always struggled to try and understand, because, so my background, I'm originally, my family from Nigeria, born and raised in the UK. Now, culturally, it's quite normal and common for Nigerians, Muslim or otherwise, to maybe date prior to marriage, get to know one's partner, and some obviously will have intimate relations before marriage. So there isn't really much of a taboo around sex outside of marriage, even though we know Islamically it's not allowed. So you will find Muslims, even myself, before I was more religious, like having relations before marriage, and you know what the religion says, but you're not ready for that. But people wasn't hiding it. Now, in some Muslim communities which are a bit more conservative in relation to sexual relations, namely South Asian cultures, I would say, and more Arab and North African cultures, where there's a lot of taboo around sex outside of marriage. That's why a lot of that is done underground, because they can't openly say that we know it's haram, but this is what I'm doing, because culturally and socially it's completely unacceptable. Whereas in cultures which are, again, a bit more relaxed, even though they know that it's not allowed from a religious perspective, people will just say it. People will know what they're doing, and that's why, again, like I said, I think in cultures which are more conservative, especially in relation to sexual relations, you will find a lot of these things happening underground, and a number of people who are unaware of it, they will think that it doesn't happen. So you hear Muslims will say things like Muslims don't date, Muslims don't engage in prostitution, Muslims, and that's clearly not the case. The evidence shows otherwise. But maybe they have not even experienced it or witnessed it. But again, I would put it down to it's more of their culture doesn't allow relations outside of marriage, or obviously dating. So that's why a lot of these stuff is underground. And those who are aware of it, who are part of the underground, they kind of know what's going on. And everyone else is just like, they're clueless. That's why they're so shocked when they find out, like you mentioned, the scandal which happened in Leicester. And there was a famous khutbah that went viral, and the imam was talking about it, that there were men, old men, young men, bearded men, people that, were coming from the mosque. And that's why a lot of people were shocked by it, because I think their assumption is, okay, if someone is Muslim, if someone is going to the mosque, how can they be engaging in these acts? The reality is there's a number of men who are in sexless marriages. There are a number of men who are sexually frustrated. There are some men who are incels. There are just some men who just want to have casual sex, and some men who don't even see it as such a bad thing, if I'm going to be completely honest with you, from conversations that I've had with men who are Johns. But when it comes to female sexuality, it's a very different story altogether. So they're more than happy to have casual relations with a woman that they consider to be less than, but if it's their wife, their sister, their mother, completely unacceptable, or a Muslim woman. So they've got like the I think, was it Freud's, that called the Madonna whore complex, where they look at women differently. Like if it's a saintly figure, a righteous woman, she has to conduct herself a certain way, she has to be virtuous. Where if it's a woman who they consider to be of ill repute, they can treat her anyhow. And again, it's not what the religion teaches, but unfortunately it's pervasive in a number of Muslim cultures, and a number of Muslim men do have that attitude. And funny enough, a number of those same men who may engage in illicit relations prior to marriage and sleep around, when they want to get married, they want to find a virgin woman who's never had any relations before. And it's a lot of it's hypocrisy, to be completely honest with you. Again, it's not from the religion. I want to emphasize that, but there is a lot of hypocrisy in a number of Muslim communities, and it's not called out as well by a number of men. So men know what goes on, but it's kind of like seen as men are polygamous by nature, or men have a propensity to cheat. So that's why we will make excuses. I mean, I'm using we as a collective, we as men will make excuses for male misbehavior, whereas if it was for a woman, again, it's completely not tolerated.
These narratives overlap heavily with what we've been hearing in what we call the Muslim manosphere, the Muslim Redpill, for the past 10 years now. And where do you think this phenomenon comes from, in these derogatory narratives about women?
I think there's a number of men who are suffering in silence. There are a number of men who are vulnerable. And what I mean by vulnerable, they might be educated formally, but in terms of having healthy relations with the opposite sex is quite lacking. So they're quite immature as well, especially emotionally. And obviously they've got desires like anyone else. Maybe they're struggling and they can't afford to get married because the economy is extremely difficult. And a number of women, their expectations of husband, I don't want to say it's unrealistic, but a lot of men can't afford it. So a lot of men, they've got high testosterone, they've got these desires, but they can't exercise these desires. And they've come across, initially it was non-Muslims in the manosphere speaking about men's issues. And then you have now Muslims using Islamic terms and basically saying the same thing that the non-Muslim manosphere was speaking about their concerns, speaking about how men have a right to be polygamous and have a right to have multiple women, but you need to make the money, you need to be that high value man, and then you can get the woman you want. And they're speaking to the voiceless. They're speaking to men who feel like, as one person he said that the modern world is a gynecology. He said it's gynocentric. It's just around the woman, and everything they look at feminism as if it's very evil and it's not catering or acknowledging men, and men are being eliminated. So that's why they find the manosphere is a place where males' voices and frustrations are validated, and they're also providing some benefits. Although a lot of people may have issues with the manosphere and the red pill, but there's some of their talking points. They do provide some solutions for men in terms of self-improvement, in terms of not prioritizing a woman until you're in a position where you can look after a woman, and also to be someone who's strong and physically fit. But a lot of their talking points are quite capitalistic as well, where it's all about the money, and a man is valued by how much money he makes. And that's also, again, from an Islamic perspective, is extremely problematic. But a number of the men who also buy into it, especially, like I said, the young, impressionable and vulnerable men, I've noticed a number of them come from either socially disadvantaged backgrounds, so that's why they're easily lured in, or also men who maybe have come from a difficult relationship or failed relationship or divorce, and they're frustrated maybe because they've been to divorce and the wife has taken their assets, and they feel like he's more or less become destitute. So it's like one of my friends, he said it's like the revenge of the nerds, because a number of these men that even talk about red pill or have now become spokespersons, they were people who were maybe socially awkward, maybe when in their formative years, maybe they didn't get attention from women, maybe they didn't have relationships. Now that they've got the power in terms of like the money and the social status, now they want to use that to kind of get to attack women because of what happened to them in the early years. So again, it's one of the things which it's a problematic issue, because I understand why men are listening to the red pill, because they find that a number of the religious leaders, they're not speaking about men's issues. And they will say that a number of the men or religious leaders will pander to women. I've been accused of that as well. They'll say that you're just speaking about women's issues, you're pandering to women, or you want to be a feminist. But men's issues, not enough men, they say, vocally speak about men's issues, and they feel like there's an attack on masculinity, also not only in religious spheres, but also in mainstream media. That the role of what it means to be a man in terms of traditionally a provider, someone who's a leader of the household, that is now deemed to be somewhat toxic. So because of that, the only people that you could say are going against that grain, generally speaking, are people that are coming from either religious perspective with traditional values, or those who are speaking from the manosphere. So that's why with the manosphere, I think why it's even more appealing, because they're speaking from the traditional perspective of what it means to be a man, and they're quite aspirational, but also they have the luxury, which again a lot of men are appealed by, whether it's the cars, the women, and again it's like I said, it more appeals to, I think, men from socially disadvantaged backgrounds, or men who've come from experienced difficult relationships with women, and they're trying to obviously connect with women again. And for those men, these men from the red pill or manosphere are providing practical solutions.
It echoes a lot of what I've read. I'm thinking especially the works of Bell Hooks, when she mentions that the men are not given like a space. They're not given time to be heard. In a society that constantly pushes men to be breadwinners, to be strong protectors. Especially, I mean, she comes from the African American perspective, but. And this is also some works in the UK have echoed that, people studying Muslim gangs in Bradford, like Mohammed Qasim, I don't know if you've come across him. So he argues that young men, especially when we're talking about young Muslim men in the UK who are in the lowest social economic kind of situation, are feeling a state of siege where the society is not there for them to be able to flourish. It's impossible to find jobs. It's impossible to find a suitable career. And this is why, among other reasons, why they get into crime. And this is why, especially in a society that kind of rewards violence, people embrace violence not only like in the public sphere between them, but also this is something that they project on women and other people around them. Is there a fix for that? And if so, would it be? How can we fix that?
I think we need to have honest conversations with ourselves, and we might need to readjust our expectations, both men and women alike. And the reason why I'm saying this is that you have some men who come from traditional backgrounds where they're expected to be the breadwinner, like you said. They're expected to provide. Now, that might be the ideal, and that might be what is the narrative that is said in a lot of the masajids. In reality, a lot of men cannot afford to provide for both themselves and their wives. And most men in the West, that is the reality. And that doesn't make them emasculated. There's nothing emasculating about that. But I think that narrative needs to change. But if you have this expectation, and also if the woman has the expectation that I'm just going to be the housewife and go to Dubai when I like, and you're going to give me everything, and my money is my money, your money is our money, and they're using Islam to justify that, then the men is under pressure, Muslim men, because you're using a religion to say that, okay, I have to provide because men are the qawamun, men are the maintainers. I have to maintain for you financially, and also this idea that we have to marry, we have to be relatively the same age, which is again is a very modern, you can say, understanding, because traditionally men were always older than their wives, or it was socially acceptable. Whereas in the Western society, we're supposed to be around the same age, so we're supposed to be around the same age, maybe a couple of years out of university, and I'm supposed to be able to provide for both myself and you, and I'm not nowhere near where I should be financially, and it can take me a while. It's unrealistic expectations. So if the woman has those expectations, or she has an expectation of the dowry, the bridal gift of like £50,000, £75,000, which is astronomical, especially in this climate, it's unrealistic. Either it's going to be very difficult for her to find someone, or the man is going to maybe feel like he needs to do crime in order to meet her needs. So this is where, like I said, I think the expectations, what it means to be a man, what is the man's role in inverted commas, I think that needs to be changed, because I think this idealistic image that people present or talk about what Islam says, it's not actually clear cut. The way they make it out, like Islamically, the man is supposed to be the provider, and the woman's supposed to stay at home. And like I said, I noticed that it's more prevalent in some cultures more than others. Like I've got some friends from the Indian subcontinent who, for them, like their wife shouldn't work, and that's why a number of brothers that I know of haven't got married until maybe their late 30s, early 40s, because that's their expectation, that the wife shouldn't work. I'm from a background where it's normal for women to work. I grew up with my mum working. So just for the idea that women shouldn't work or shouldn't contribute is alien to me. And I never looked at, if you're in a relationship and you're with a woman and she's working and that she's supporting the household, that your masculinity is diminished. I don't have that mindset. But again, if someone has come from that very traditional, or what they understand to be an Islamic understanding, then I would say that that narrative maybe needs to change somewhat. They need to have more expectations. But if you want to have that mindset, or that hierarchical approach where you see marriage as the man is dominant and the woman is completely subservient to the woman, that's why a number of the men will go back home, they'll call it, because that's affordable, because they can afford to provide fully for a woman in that case. And some men do have that, they still want that type of relationship. Whereas because a lot of women, I would argue, especially in the West, want more of a partnership, but then a number of those women still want the traditional roles of the man providing. And that's why, again, like I said, the expectations, it needs to change from both sides, because there's nothing wrong with a woman, in my understanding of Islam and just reality, with women working. There's nothing wrong with a woman contributing to the household, and it doesn't make a man less masculine. It doesn't make him less of a man. But that narrative, like I said, that like it's less than maybe like the 1% that maybe people will talk about, of the high value man that provides for his wife and all the women and they just stay at home. It's fantasy. It's not reality. And the same way people will talk about adult entertainment as being unrealistic in terms of intimate relations, that narrative that people talk about is unrealistic and talk about relationships, because even people that are relatively well off a number of their wives work as well. So this idea of just the woman staying in and the man just going out and bringing home the bacon, bringing home, I don't know, the lahm, the meat, whatever. Again, it's just not realistic. And when people have honest conversations with people, especially in the West, most people are not living like that. Those who do have that relationship, it's generally of a previous generation, and they're trying to relive maybe like how their parents lived, and the women generally are not really going to tolerate that. And I think even the men themselves, they don't really want the same relationship that their parents have. As much as they will say, my mother just stayed at home while my dad was working and this, that and the other, a lot of the men, they're not like their fathers. They don't want the same type of relationship. So why is it you want the alpha male breadwinner that your dad was, but in terms of you going to trips and going to Dubai and doing this, that and the other, a lot of our parents' generation didn't do that. So again, I just think it's the expectations, because you could have all the money in the world, all the knowledge in the world as well, but if you have unrealistic expectations, you're always going to be at loggerheads. And that's why, again, like I said, where men feel under pressure, because when I go back to parts of Africa or parts of countries that are more impoverished, they don't have these issues, because they don't judge masculinity the way we judge masculinity. That by a breadwinner, you need to have completely provide, and your wife can't work. They don't have that mindset, so they don't look at my wife working makes me masculine, or my wife working and I'm not working makes me a house husband. They don't have these concepts, so that's why, again, I just think, and it comes from both sides. It's not just men. Some women have this unrealistic expectation and not understanding the climate that we're living in. And again, I think sometimes religious preachers will give an image of Islam or the gender roles that is talking about a small segment of society. You know, so when people talk about this is what Islam says, this is how men should be, this is how women should be. Even during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, we had women that were working. You know, so people make it out like all the men were working, all of the women were at home, but that's not the case. And also we have to remember, in that society, you had free people, you had slave people. A lot of the women that were at home or in their tents or not working, they were also being helped by women who were enslaved. People forget that. Where you don't have that society now where everyone's free, how are you expecting, not everyone's going to be aristocrat. Not everyone's going to be the wealthy Arab woman who her husband, it can provide for her. Now, if that's your case, okay, great, but that's not the case for most people. And that's why I just think the narrative and the expectations that come from not only our homes, but the masajids, that also needs to change. And obviously, mainstream media, there's only so much we can do because we can't really control that. But we ourselves, I think many of us have bought into an expectation of what is manhood, what is masculinity, and how the marriage role should be performed, when, again, like I said, in many cases it's not realistic. So that's what I think needs to change, the expectations.
Is it also, you think, because the modern society pushes us away from each other, like it atomizes people, like we're not as much in touch with our parents anymore than like the previous generation? It's very difficult for men, it's very difficult to have friends they see very often. Even the mosque is not guaranteed. We find the brotherhood we're talking about. Do you think it has a play in that?
We're a very in an individualistic society as well. Whereas I think, especially in the past, and maybe other communities are more communal. People know what other people are going through. There's support. Whereas I think, especially as men, and we generally don't vocalize about what we're going through, especially from a personal perspective. So we've got the weight. We feel like sometimes we've got the whole weight of the world on our shoulders, and we just have to manage and cope. And that's what it means to be a man. And again, if you had communities or people, or a real sense of brotherhood, not just saying salam and things like that, but you can open up to in terms of and hear what other people are going through. So in addition to, what your previous question about what to fix this, not only the change in expectations, we need to talk more about the reality. Like in terms of, again, these narratives that you're hearing, okay, but that's like it's unique, but everyday issues, because a lot of men in particular, I would say, don't really know what people are going through in terms of behind the doors. They're not aware of the realities, like people's actual dynamics. There are a number of people that men maybe not be working, but their wife is working, and it's fine. But because he doesn't look at it as, I'm less than as a man. But they don't really hear those stories. So they just assume that everyone is, you know, all the men are working and the women are being, it doesn't work like that. And again, if you're having, I don't want to call them success stories, just the reality of life, like the reality of relationships. Because like I said, a lot of people aren't aware of it. They're just hearing maybe what people say on podcasts or again on YouTube, and a lot of it is really, it's performative as well. And it's also just to entertain, and a number of people aren't able to differentiate, especially those who are not in a long-term committed relationship or married. They're not able to differentiate between what is just entertainment and what is actually speaking about the realities of relationships. There's going to be compromise, there's going to be sacrifice, there's going to be things, ups and downs. That's just normal, that's life. But if you don't have those life skills and also a level of empathy as well, you would just look at a relationship as purely transactional. And that's why I just think there's a lot of education that needs to be done, even amongst men themselves. But again, I think because we're quite individualistic, especially in the society we're living in now, and it's difficult for men to open up because, you know, we also see it as we want to protect our family. So you're not just going to open up to anyone, and you might be reluctant to open up to some people because you don't want to come across as being vulnerable. But it's just presenting, I think, an honest narrative in terms of what the realities are of life, of relationships. And it doesn't make you, again, like I said, lesser than a man or make you emasculate or emasculate you in any way. And when I'm speaking to Muslims in particular, I'd use the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, because that is someone that we all can agree, that we all respect, and that is a man that we would admire to aspire to be like. A lot of the stereotypes or the high value man or the expectations that people expect, when you look at his life and how it was with his wives, he didn't have those expectations, that lifestyle that we're trying to live up to. So I always try to speak to men and tell them, like, this idea of masculinity or this high value man or this status, who are you trying to emulate? Is it the messenger of Allah, or is it this YouTuber? Is it your friend? Is it your coach? And a lot of times it's not from a religious perspective. And that's why, again, and just to add to that, because even with the religious side now, I was saying this to someone recently, that traditionally, even if you look at like the scholars of the past, the classical scholars, a lot of them were poor, right? Because they spent so much time studying and traveling and writing and this, that, and the other. So they couldn't afford even to get married. But nowadays, a lot of, like, you could say, the modern scholar or intellectual from an Islamic perspective, they have the money, they have the social status, they have the multiple wives, and it's just unrealistic, especially when you compare it to the classical model, because it's like, so people think they can have it all. You can have the Dubai apartment or the Qatar apartment. You can have the multiple wives. You can be an entrepreneur. You can be you can have all of this, and it's just like, that just doesn't sound right, because even people non-Muslim, they don't have it all. So how is it that you are speaking from a religious perspective and you literally have it all? Again, like I said, and that's where, when you go behind the veil, so to speak, you see a lot of cracks and you see a lot of malpractices, and that's what's coming to light in the last couple of years as well. That again, and that's why, again, having honest conversation, and even for men to realize this idea you can have it all, I think sometimes it's quite far-fetched.
Do you think also that these factors play a role in the fact that lots of Muslim men lack sexual literacy or relationship literacy, or even like how to sustain a healthy marriage? Because I often quote the example of some people that I know who, for example, on their wedding night had to Google how to kiss. And I realized, this is something even my own parents, they're not Muslim, but they never taught me about that. I had to discover through trial and error, like even where there was no internet. So like it was relationships. And you get a lot of, a mix of some, like, you don't know what's good and bad advice, really. So what's the problem there?
Yeah, that is an area that, obviously, for the work that I do, I'm well aware of. And because I get so many messages or speaking to a number of people, that now I'm not shocked by any of those, like that comment that you made. And again, I have a lot of empathy for people, because a number of people, they're just not aware. So if you've come from a culture, like I said, which is extremely conservative, the opposite sex is seen as fitna, and you don't go near them, and this, that, and the other, and you haven't had healthy relationships, or you haven't even seen healthy relationships, or the only relationships you may have come across is from like adult entertainment, like pornography and things like that, or even if you've abstained from that. Now when you're lawful for one another, you're married, you know, people don't know, how do I kiss, which hole, how many holes, like these are real questions that people have. Or if a woman is struggling with like vaginismus, the man thinks that, oh, she's just making it up and he wants to force his way in. Like there's a lot of, because of the expectation that you have to consummate the marriage, and just not having empathy, not having understanding that, okay, even if your wife is not interested or is finding it difficult, you're supposed to be patient. There's common sense, but it's like, no, I need to consummate the marriage by such and such. I need to do it within 3 days because that's the sunnah and this, that and the other bit. And a lot of it, like I said, is because people lack sexual education, lack sexual literacy, haven't had experiences with the opposite sex. Now, again, I'm not saying that people should have relations prior to marriage, but one of the things, if I'm going to be completely honest, if you have had relations or seen healthy relations, a lot of these hang-ups you wouldn't have, because it's like someone asking, how does a woman like to be kissed? It depends on the woman. How does a woman like to be pleased in the bed? It depends on the woman. Now, obviously, there's certain principles that you should have and certain things that you should concentrate on, which is obvious. But in terms of like a step-by-step approach, it varies. It's not like if you do this, this will happen. But I think because, again, like I said, a lot of Muslims that I've noticed, especially from certain communities, their view of the opposite sex, mainly men's view of women, is troubling. You know, where they just see them as vessels of pleasure or vessels of procreation. Like, you're just there to serve me sexually or serve me by having children. Other than that, in terms of building a bond, in terms of having, a lot of them, they have it's hard to understand because I don't come from that culture. It's only when I, like I said, started doing some of the work that I'm doing and studying, and I'm speaking to men from different cultural backgrounds, because I'm Muslim and I didn't have those hang-ups. So I was wondering, is it from the religion? Like, is my understanding, my upbringing wrong because we was a bit more relaxed? Or is this conservative, puritanical, prudish approach, is this really Islam, or is this an interpretation that this is why people have this understanding? I would argue it's the latter, that a number of Muslims have a very, puritanical understanding of Islam, where, again, women are seen as, complete fitna. You can't be near them. They're the devil's, plaything. So, but now, when they're now married, it's like, how do I turn on the switch and please her and I can enjoy myself as well? So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And again, I do have a lot of empathy for such individuals, but it's important that one has to, especially when they're just about to get married. But the fact that actually the person asks you that question, that's actually a good thing, because they're reaching out that, okay, now I'm getting married, I'm married, how do I do such and such? Because I'm not, indulged, or I don't know anything about this. So there's good in that. I wouldn't expect them to know everything, especially if they haven't indulged. So, but I would just say that that's where I'm glad that someone actually reached out to you, rather than they go into the bedroom and then they, it can cause a lot of distress and a lot of trauma as well. So, but I just think there has to be people who are comfortable to educate and to understand also from their cultural perspective, because I wouldn't look down on someone or make fun of someone for not knowing these things, because people know these things either by, like you said, trial and error through their own experience. Now, if you've been told you can't read, listen, experience any of that, how would you know? You wouldn't know, So I just think that Muslims, those who are comfortable to kind of have those conversations, to educate people and talk about that, this is not an uncommon phenomenon. A lot of people are struggling with these issues, or there's a number of people who have had sexual relations, a number of sexual relations, but they're not enjoying intimacy. And that happens a lot with women, that they can have multiple sexual partners, but they've never had an orgasm. So some people might be shocked by that, because they just assume the more sexual partners you've had, the better you are at sex, or the more sex you're enjoying. That's not necessarily the case. Likewise, there are a lot of myths and misconceptions around sex and intimacy, especially within the Muslim community, especially pertaining to women, because like I mentioned earlier, these double standards usually kind of like favor men, in the sense of men can sleep around, men can enjoy themselves and then be righteous and practicing and marry a good virgin woman. Whereas if a woman even asks a question about intimacy or just curious, a number of men unfortunately would even look at her as being immoral, promiscuous. So that's why a lot of women are shut down, shut down intellectually with their mind or their body, and a lot of men are not aware of that, or they're told you're not allowed to speak about sex, don't go near boys. Then when you get to like 25, where's your husband? And then they expect them to go, now you're married. Then all of a sudden the man as well, maybe because he's been miseducated by a lot of porn and what he's heard and a lot of bravado from other men, he then expects her to do all of the things that he's heard or seen. And again, it's unrealistic. Again, it comes down to unrealistic expectations. So you want this, and I don't like to use the word pure, but this pure virgin woman had no experience whatsoever, but then you want her to behave like a porn star. And it's just unrealistic. And then some men, after they get married, also some women, their friends will be asking, how was it? Then the bravado, you need to say, it was like this, it was like that. And again, obviously we're not supposed to divulge what we do in the bedroom, but we're just about the reality of what actually happens. So there is a lot of pressure on both ways, from the men and the woman. But education is definitely one way of I would say, eradicating that knowledge gap and the anxiety that a number of people are experiencing. And it's not uncommon. People shouldn't feel because they're, whether they're in their mid-20s, 30s, what have you, that they don't know this or they don't know that, because a lot of things that we do know is by our own experience or by osmosis, and you can't control really what's around you or your upbringing. So if you've been raised in a certain environment where you've been told about this, or your friends have exposed you to certain things, that's why for you it's second nature, or because of your experiences. If someone hasn't had that background, you can't expect them to have that same level of understanding, that you have.
When it comes to your work about sexual literacy, intimacy, I have been a bit not surprised really or shocked, because now I don't have any expectations, but about the contrast between like how important, because you talk about very important things which I believe are just fundamental, how to sustain like a healthy relationship with intimacy and stuff. But the backlash you get sometimes, it really horrifies me. But I'm curious, what are you, among your audience, who is, you think, the most receptive to your works, and who is the least receptive to your work?
That's a great question. No one's asked me that before. That's a very good question. Sorry. That's a very good question. Non-Muslim women are most receptive to my work, and Muslim men are least receptive from certain parts of the world. I can go into more detail in terms of their demographic, which I think, but overall, I would say non-Muslim women are most receptive for my work, and Muslim men are least receptive of my work. And which is quite surprising for me, given that when I was writing my books on like erotology and intimacy, the target audience was Muslim men to please Muslim women. So it's a thing where, and obviously there's Muslim women that are receptive, but you ask most and least. And that's why, like with my work, because even though most of my books are targeted to a Muslim audience, I've also written a couple of books that's not targeted to a Muslim audience, because of the backlash I was receiving from a couple of the books, and it wasn't being received as well as I thought it would be. So I thought, let me just target like a general book from an African cultural perspective. And that book was well received. BBC contacted me, we did a documentary. Then I got a lot from non-Muslims asking about that book. Then when that book did really well, then Muslims were now intrigued. You're Muslim, what does Islam say? So that's why, again, it's quite and I think one of the reasons why a number of Muslims are not receptive to my work, Muslim men in particular, is because they think that it's un-Islamic. They're not aware that within our tradition, there have been many Muslim scholars that have written about sex. There have been many Muslim scholars that have written sex manuals. So because they're unaware of that, they look at it like what I'm doing is immoral. What I'm talking about is against their understanding of modesty or haya. So that's why they feel they need to refute me, or to say that this is, again, completely wrong because of their upbringing. So I understand where they're coming from. And that's why, again, when I'm speaking to, because I studied abroad, trained at a reputable Islamic institute, so I've got access to a number of the sources. So when I'm mentioning the names of scholars like Jalal ad-Din as-Suyuti from the 15th century, Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi from Andalusia, Qadi Abdul Qadir al-Shadhili, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, Muhammad al-Nafsawi. I mentioned all of these scholars that are jahid intentionally, so they know that I'm not just picking one or two isolated. I'm mentioning heavyweights, prominent scholars that many of them are familiar with, but they didn't know that a number of them wrote sex manuals or wrote candidly about sex. And they're not just talking about how to please a woman, they're also speaking about sexual issues that they were going through in their time, like in their period, whether it was lesbianism, whether it's pedastry, which was going on in Muslim communities that many Muslims are shocked by, because they think that up until colonization, Muslims, there was no debauchery, there was no immoral behavior. It's the West that came in and introduced all of this, which is nonsense. Anyone who's aware of history will know that many of the issues that we're facing now, prostitution, sexual immorality, existed in many parts of the Muslim world, and Muslim scholars were speaking about it. And some people, unfortunately, even used the religion to justify it. So this is where scholars of the time, or erotologists, they were speaking about social issues. So that's why, because again, I'm familiar with those classical works, I'm not surprised by, some of the resistance that many Muslims have, because again, many of them do not have access to the Arabic language, and many of them do not read or haven't read this. With the non-Muslim women, I think maybe again because maybe they're from more of a background where they're more appreciative of maybe a man speaking about the importance of women's sexual pleasure and prioritizing women's sexual pleasure. And I'm speaking from both an Islamic perspective as well as a cultural perspective, that Islam as a religion speaks about the importance of women's sexual satisfaction and encourages men to ensure that their wife is satisfied before themselves. And likewise, I'm talking about certain cultures like Rwanda, which prioritizes women's pleasure and is telling men that to ensure that your wife is sexually satisfied and can climax before yourself. So again, because these are like new narratives from both a religious perspective and a cultural perspective, I think that's why a lot of non-Muslims, women in particular, are more intrigued, because they've never heard about that. And then again, like I said, with the Muslim men, a lot of them I think are very resistant to it, because they've been taught or grown up to believe that sex is just about the man. Men can have up to multiple wives, 4 wives, because we're polygamous by nature. We don't need to worry about women. Her job is to produce children and serve me sexually, because that's the narrative that they've heard, even from a religious perspective. It's just shocking that someone is speaking about the importance of women's sexual satisfaction. And because, again, like I said, many of them have not come across this material before.
What in your journey led you to investigate these issues?
Curiosity. I'm quite a curious person. So like I said, I was born and raised in the UK from a Nigerian household. I wasn't really interested in the religion although I went to a mosque for a number of years. When probably my late teens, early 20s, a friend of mine passed away, and I started to really think more about, I need to understand who God is, what's going to happen next after, when I pass away. So that's why I wanted to really learn if Islam is the truth, because I had a lot of doubts. I read about Christianity. Half of my family from my mother's side are Christian, and one of my aunts used to always say, you should become a Christian and this, that and the other, but I never was comfortable with the idea of worshipping a man. So even when I used to go to a church, there's a girl that I was dating at the time who was Christian as well, but that was the only thing I was never comfortable with, just the idea of worshipping a man. But growing up in a mosque, if I'm completely honest with you, I didn't feel connected, because I'm studying or reading a text I don't understand. I'm getting beaten for not memorizing something, and the treatment I'm receiving in the mosque is very different from my state schooling. So the experience in the mosque, I didn't warm to want to practice Islam, if I'm completely honest with you. But when I started, again, like I said, my late teens, early 20s, even though I still was Muslim, but not really conscious of the deen. I would read the Quran, and when I was reading the Quran for myself and in the English, it was more intrigued and wanted to know more. And I would listen to Islamic lectures, and it was always like a burning desire. I want to understand the Quran. I want to understand what Allah is saying. I don't want to understand it via a speaker or who's giving their interpretation. And that led me to study Arabic. Then I went abroad to Egypt. And then when I was studying in Al-Azhar, I came across a number of sex manuals written by Muslim scholars. And I was selling them in the street as well, sex manuals by classical scholars like Al-Kindi, As-Suyuti, who I mentioned earlier. And I was surprised that I've heard of As-Suyuti, and a number of these books have been translated into English. But this compilation, it was called The Secrets of Intimacy and Women's Pleasure. And I was thinking, okay, this is, I was like, okay, I'm intrigued. I was like, okay, this is more what I'm interested in. But I was always curious that why is it, I wasn't taught this when I was in the UK. They don't talk about this. Everything was very hush-hush. You don't talk about these matters. And they're speaking very explicitly. They had sexual humour. There's jokes, but they're speaking about real issues. It wasn't just like instruction manuals, do this, do that. It was just talking about issues that they were facing and how they were advising people to overcome these issues, and they were citing sources from the Kama Sutra, from ancient Greek philosophers. So I was like, okay, these are people that are well ahead of their time. They wasn't just yes, I'm talking about the Quran and the Sunnah, but they're also making use of other knowledge of their time and seeing, okay, from an Islamic perspective, how we can help the Muslim community. So I thought, okay, this would be a really interesting book. The same way I'm intrigued by it, I'm sure there might be other people who might be intrigued by this, to learn about this from about our Islamic heritage. So that's why I went about, translating that and talking about other things that I thought might be interesting for a modern day reader, and to kind of like write a modern day manual guide on sexual ethics and the art of intimacy. And the reason why sexual ethics as opposed to the legal rules, because when I was studying Islamic law, you learn about like the rules, what you're supposed to do after intercourse, and in terms of purification, this, that, and the other. But in terms of the morality, the ethics side, I found that more in the sex manuals, in the books of erotology. And even when I was in Egypt, I saw a number of people who were outwardly very religious, some people who were knowledgeable, who were engaging in these like sexual malpractices where they would marry a woman for like a couple of weeks and then divorce her. And then they will say, this is technically halal. And you had people that were coming from the Gulf, people coming from the UK, US, who marry like a young woman from like Giza, from the villages, get a sheikh, bring 2 witnesses, give her family maybe like £2,000. So that's her bridal gift or bridal price. So they've done all of the legal, the fiqh. So technically it's halal, it's a valid nikah. They spend time with her for maybe a couple of weeks, divorce her, then they go back to their family. It's a secret wife, no one knows, but it's clearly immoral. I was like, but the people I'm speaking to, a number of them said, yeah, it's allowed. Islamically, you're allowed. But I didn't see this type of behavior, obviously, during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. But I saw it in a number of the fiqh manuals that they were speculating, if this were to happen, if a man marries a woman with the intention of divorce, is that marriage valid or not? But these are all like technical arguments, legalistic arguments. But people were using some of these legal rulings to and putting into practice. And that's why I was like, okay, this is a problem, because a lot of Muslims have come from, view the religion as just purely from a legalistic perspective. And what my friend calls, they practice Islam by technicality. And it's just, it's following the fiqh, but without the ethics, without the morals. And this is where, again, I realized, okay, something needs to be done about this, but I'm not someone who likes to give speeches. I'm not in like the dawah circuit or wanting to become an imam or anything. So I said, okay, maybe because I've come across this, maybe to put this in the form of a book format and to talk about this in terms of understanding ethics and the spirit of the law. Not everything is about the legality, because like I said, when people talk about the Sharia encompasses creed, like our belief, your legal acts, and also ethics, the principles, the morals behind those acts. So it's not just about, because what people fail to realize is that a scholar or a jurist is going to just judge your legal acts. They don't know your intention. Only you and Allah knows your intention. But it doesn't mean because you can fault a scholar that you can fault Allah, you can fault the Sharia. But because a lot of people's understanding of the Sharia is very simplistic, they just reduce it to the legal act. So they feel that if I can technically get this fatwa, this legal ruling that justifies this, even though it's clearly immoral, then I can go ahead and do it. And Islam justifies it when Islam doesn't. So that's where I wanted to talk about erotology from like an Islamic perspective. But like I said, when that book, A Taste of Honey, came out in 2015, it wasn't as well received as I thought it would be by the Muslims. And that's why I thought, okay, let me talk about this topic, but from a cultural perspective, like an African perspective, because a lot of the Muslims I found, especially in the UK, maybe predominantly because South Asian cultures, it's a bit more conservative. And a lot of West African Muslims don't read, the community that I'm from. So they're interested, but they don't really read. And of the South Asians who do read, more than West Africans in my experience, but they found the topic a bit too taboo. So then I started to look at the topic, but from a cultural perspective. And that's what was my other book, Kunyaza, what that was about.
Another question I had, as mainly from the perspective of you being on an online platform, and is how do you deal with all the online violence, people who don't understand your work, or just, throw expletives at you without understanding what your work is about?
Well, online violence, I've not heard that before, but it's true. I'm quite thick-skinned, maybe me being Nigerian and Yoruba in particular, so it doesn't bother me personally, to be honest. Or what I do, I'll try and highlight and I'll anonymize it, but I'll repost some of the ridiculous comments I've received just so people can see the ignorance that's out there. Because again, like I said, it's ignorance, people that don't know. And I would argue that a lot of people that make these attacks they've got compounded ignorance, meaning they don't know and they don't realize they don't know, which is even worse. It's called Jahal Murakkab in Arabic. So there's a simple type of ignorance that, you don't know something, but you acknowledge that you don't know something, which you're encouraged to ask for help or seek knowledge. But someone who doesn't know something and they don't realize that they don't know something, that's the worst type of person because they're ignorant and they don't realize they're ignorant. So, and you do find a lot of people like that. Those people I'm not really concerned with because, again, you can't really change someone who who want to live like that, or but it's those people who are unaware. Again, a lot of people, like I said, who have maybe like the simple ignorance, who are just unaware, they've not been exposed to this. It's to kind of let people know this is also part of the reason why I'm doing the work that I'm doing, because this is the attitude that a number of people have. So again, I don't really, I also expected some backlash as well, but that's why my main concern is, as long as what I'm saying is factually correct. If someone was going to correct me, like I said, you've misquoted such and such, or this scholar didn't say this, or then I would look close in terms of what they've said or the research I'm presenting. If someone disagrees with my conclusion, that's fine. If someone disagrees with my presentation, that's fine. If someone disagrees and says, you shouldn't have women talking on your platform, again, that's fine. That's their prerogative. I don't have any issues with that. Doesn't mean I have to agree with it, likewise, but people have criticism for different reasons, and I think a number of people, it's coming from a good place, as in they look at it like they're defending the religion. Because if this is what they taught, this is what Islam is. If they were taught that women shouldn't go out in public, women's face shouldn't be seen, and then you're getting some guy showing a woman and she's talking and she's not wearing a hijab and she might not even be Muslim, whatever, then for him, he looks like, I need to protect the religion. Or he's using some words and this is immodest, because he doesn't realize that our understanding of modesty, or his understanding or her understanding of modesty, is very conservative, is arguably more conservative than the time of the Prophet and the companions. He needs to be, or she needs to be, educated. That's what it is. So a number of Muslims have a very puritanical approach towards sexual intimacy, and there are also a number of double standards. So I do find when I'm talking about the double standards in the community, because I see it as a man, I benefit from it and I can just keep quiet if I wanted to, but it'd be quite hypocritical for me to talk about the reality and what I see, when, like in my first book, I was talking about the anti-black racism in the Muslim community. So if I'm speaking about the anti-black racism which exists, and asking South Asians or white people, Arabs, to kind of talk about this and don't pretend like it doesn't exist, but because they're benefiting from it, they're keeping quiet. But now something I'm benefiting from, because obviously as the male privilege and things like that, I'm just keeping quiet when I know there's a lot of malpractices. I know there's a number of interpretations, which it's an interpretation, but there are other interpretations. But people would just give a very patriarchal interpretation and make out like that's the only interpretation of Islam, when there are other interpretations, and this is way before feminism. So it's not like this is a new interpretation that sometimes I'll be presenting, or like ensuring that women have the right to intimacy just as much as men. Men should be ethical, should be moral, not just because you technically don't need to tell your wife you're taking a second wife that you can have a secret second wife. It doesn't work like that. So when I put that out there, a number of men feel like I'm going against polygamy. It's like, I'm from Nigeria. Polygamy is the cultural norm. But the way it's practiced in Nigeria, it's not done by cowards. As in men, the men that do it, they're called cowards. But it's openly done that men have 2, 3, 4 wives. But the way it's done I noticed in a number of Muslim communities in the UK, it's done, behind the door, and men are hiding behind it. And these are people of religion, and they're using a religion to justify this. It's cowardice behavior. Just call it what it is, But so that's why, again, that's my approach. Number one, I expect it, so it is what it is. Number two, I'm thick-skinned, and I always try to just say, and I've got a bit of a sharp tongue, so sometimes I'll give back just as good as I receive sometimes, and I find that also quite entertaining, because otherwise, yeah, and I'm not arrogant enough to feel that or to believe that everyone is going to agree with my work, or because if that was the case, I would be horrified when I get criticized. So, but the online violence that you've stated, yeah, it's more of a thing of, I was saying this to someone as well, that if I was a woman, it'd be very difficult to do what I'm doing. Because I've seen a couple of women, I do try to amplify women sex educators or experts or scholars' voice, but the vitriol and the attacks that women get, yeah, I can't understand. And I think, again, it comes down to a number of Muslims, both men and women alike, they don't see women as authoritative voices in a religious space. Like, if a woman's speaking, if she's not wearing a hijab, first question is, why are you wearing a hijab? If she's wearing a hijab, her hair showing, why is your hair showing? If her hair's not showing, why are you wearing lipstick? If she's not wearing lipstick, why are you talking? Why are you not married? Or why, if you're married, why is your husband allowing you to speak? He must be the youth. You know, or if she's wearing niqab, oh, you shouldn't be talking anyway. The woman's voice is an awra. So there's always an excuse for a woman to silence her voice and to marginalize her voice. Whereas with a man, there's only so much they can say. So that's why, if anything, I look at it like it's an important issue that, again, because I'm a man, I won't get as much backlash. So therefore, I should try and do the bit that I can. Because I didn't really want to talk too much about or post too much about Islamic related stuff on my page, because I moved away from that a few years ago. But it's only like in the last maybe 4 or 5 months I started reposting again about these issues, because I didn't realize how little Muslims, or how much Muslims didn't know about these issues, and they thought some of these malpractices were Islamic, you know. So that's why I thought, okay, let me try and educate people somewhat, because I intentionally stayed clear from talking about Islamic related topics for a number of years. What inspired you to speak about or to research the manosphere?
It's an issue where I have seen, first of all, the paradox between what Islam as a framework for life says about, respecting not only women, but people who are more vulnerable, especially since the manosphere has this culture of like punching down. It's always the most vulnerable they receive the kicks. And this aspiration, which is overlapping with materialist, consumerist culture, which I have been studying for a few years. I just didn't understand why was it all of a sudden very prominent. I mean, I understand there is probably the reaction with movements like Me Too, Black Lives Matter, the first Trump mandate, which made all these people in the mainstream society more vocal. And I guess some Muslims have decided to jump on the bandwagon and putting a halal or Sharia compliant twist to it. But the other issue is these narratives, although lots of people are aware that, this doesn't make any sense, they have real life consequences. And a lot of the people who follow them are very often in a situation of vulnerability. And I've seen this when I did my fieldwork in some of these Muslim get-rich-quick schemes, where a lot of the audience was either older uncles or young men, single parents, all financially struggling, but so desperate that they will give 2,000, 3,000 pounds, their all life savings, to people they didn't even know, just because these guys on the stage were saying, Alhamdulillah, mashallah, inshallah, you'll get rich, and using this religious discourse to put on an aura of legitimacy on what was ultimately a scam. And I just wish, and I will try, in my work, I'm trying to diagnose what are the issues in the society that makes people so desperate that they have to almost follow these guys and others almost as if they were religious scholars or even, prophets or saints. Like many people I've come across back in the days, they would ask religious advice not to any local imam or a religious scholar online, but to fashion influencers, because they didn't see anyone else in a situation of role model. And so I think if we see something we don't agree with, the first thing is trying to understand so we can diagnose and perhaps think about solutions. And I'm very much interested in how to reconnect people together, which I think is one of the main issues in a society, which and we have seen since the era of colonization, industrial era, the job is to divide people. So because it's basically they're easier to control that way. Yeah. So that's in a nutshell.
You mentioned some of the solutions. So after you've diagnosed the problem, or part of your work diagnosed the problem, what are some solutions that you have to solve this issue?
I'm not the kind of person that's going to say, if you want to fix A, B, C, you have to do 1, 2, and 3, because every situation is highly specific, extremely complex, nuanced. Everyone's situation is different. And, every community every community, every individual has their specific circumstances. So I don't think there is one solution for all, but I'm thinking in my personal circle of friends, in my communities, the people I work with, what can I do to help move things, change things? Again, I don't believe I have the power of changing things, because ultimately God has all the power, but I can do my bit, and maybe, if God wants, change will happen. So I had a look at initiatives in the UK, like the Futuwa retreats by Sheikh Ibrahim Osiefa. There's a friend of mine, Razwan Faraz, in Birmingham, who runs the Man Sheds, which is a retreat for men, not only Muslim men, but to share about whatever they want, do activities together. And I was wondering why there's no such thing in London. So in the past month, I've started with Rumi's Cave to organize an outdoor activity group for Muslim men, where the idea is very simple. We go outdoors, go for walks, do stuff, learn new skills, whether it is hiking, trekking, whatever, kayaking, biking, bushcrafting, and build friendship, reclaim the sense of brotherhood that this modern society has robbed from us in a way. So it feels good in the middle. I don't know if it's going to lead to anything, but I think this is maybe a good first step.
And what advice would you give to a woman, whether she's a mother or wife of a husband or son, who she fears is who's listened to the manifest and influenced in a negative way? And the reason why I say that is because even there was a sheikh that I was listening to recently from the UK, and he spoke about how he didn't realise how powerful the manosphere was until he was told by a number of women that their husband, one, divorced actually the woman because she didn't meet the ideals of what it means to be with a high value man after he was being influenced by some prominent men on the Muslim manosphere, and others who spoke about some issues that it's causing their marital relationship. So what advice would you give to any woman, whether it's a mother who's concerned about her son, or a wife who's concerned about her husband, who's watching a lot of manosphere content and she feels that it's impacted them in a negative way?
I'm not sure, first of all, that I'm in the best position to advise women, because it's like, who am I? I'm not a qualified psychologist, and I don't have I don't know the experience of a woman, and I'm not familiar with this. This is something which I think would be more suitable for let's say a couple therapist or a psychologist to talk about. But if we imagine it's a friend of mine, I'm not even sure I could do anything in that case, because this is something we know, the human brain is wired that way. The man is more likely to listen to another man than even his own wife, even if it doesn't make sense. But this is how it works largely for many people. And in that cases, and I had couples of, how can I say that in English? I had married couples, where the woman would tell me and my wife that her husband has such and such issue. And in that case, I really wish that, the husband could come and speak to me, especially if in these cases, the husband was aware that there was something wrong with his behavior or some weaknesses he has. And I really wish that in that case, we would have had a conversation together. But the issue that comes up all the time is, he's too shy to talk about it. He doesn't want to talk to anyone about it. So, how do you overcome this challenge? I don't know.
I agree. Overcoming the challenge, that's quite a difficult one. But you did answer the question, and what you said, although you said I don't have the solution, you did actually provide solutions by referring like the lady or ladies in question to go, like, for example, like a couples therapist, or stating what the reality is for a lot of men that I think some women find difficult, that a number of men, they find it more comfortable to speak to another man. So that is actually a solution. That's, you have given them practical advice. And I'll commend you for saying that, because a number of people, especially, and this is what I find quite troubling, is when people ask like questions, especially even maybe to like a religious sheikh or online or an imam, they feel they have to answer. They feel like they need to have all of the answers. And it's like, no, you can refer them to like a specialist, or like you said, a psychologist, a couple therapists. Even that is given the correct answer. Do you understand what I mean? Like, but I think sometimes when even the Muslim community, we expect too much of our religious authorities. I was saying this earlier, that our sheikhs, they're like, you have to be an imam, a YouTuber, a marriage counsellor, an intimacy expert, a Bitcoin expert, a counsellor, a psychologist, a sociologist, and someone can give you a question, and a real life question, a life coach, and you're supposed to answer it just like that. And in reality, no, it's like, this is not my speciality. Then you refer them to, and that's you showing your knowledge that this is outside my remit. We're not all experts in everything, but I think unfortunately, like I said, what happens is, and this is why I can imagine why people might go to those influencers, because anytime someone has got some form of like religious authority, they have all of the answers, and it doesn't work like that, you know. So even the way you answered it was a solution, you know, because you're telling people to refer to the experts in that respect. Also, who are the men, from your experience and your research, are more likely to get caught up in like the Muslim manosphere, like in terms of demographic background? Is there any signs that you found, or trends?
It's difficult because it's a very diverse movement, and among the people in my field work who are inclined towards these kind of views, first of all, they can stay a bit critical, so they don't agree with everything that is said in that space. But it's a mix. It's either people who are sometimes pressured by their friends, where they are in high school or early years at uni. It's sometimes people who had bad experiences with women, like horrible relationships, and they become, you know, this kind of revenge mode. It can be people who are just struggling to find anyone to build a relationship with, and are just puzzled, you know, how is the like female mind work, basically. This is the question they don't understand. But it can also be people who are well-intentioned and don't have any knowledge about this universe, and think that because some charismatic people say it online, it can bear some truth. I think, yeah, it's just a huge mix.
And are you a fan of that manosphere from a personal perspective? Like, what's your thoughts on
I mean, what is this kind of question? What is my job?
No, I'm just trying to, like, because I'm intrigued. I'm just from personal, because I think what you said, and it's important that people have nuance, in the sense of, like you said, there are a number of people, like there's some talking points for the manosphere I agree with, and I think they're correct. Some, obviously, I think it's just nonsense. But I can see some of the truths in what they're saying. I think people who are not fans of the manosphere, what I've noticed is that, especially some women that I talk to, they'll look at it like, if someone's listening to manosphere or someone who's for red pill, everything what they're saying is wrong. And I think that approach of being completely dismissive, I don't think it's helpful, because if you're making out like everything what they're saying is wrong, when there are some truth in what they're saying, and especially if it's helping someone, like if someone's been watching certain or following red pill content and it's helped improve their life, whether it's financially, from a personal perspective, help them go to the gym or what have you, to totally dismiss that, the person who you're telling him that this content is nonsense, is rubbish, is this, any other, they'll be even more defensive because they've seen the improvement themselves. If you wanted to actually, let's dissect it and see, okay, this is why this is maybe problematic and stuff like that, then we can have a more nuanced and honest conversation. And this is where the critique of the red pill and the manosphere, I think people who have some issues with it, they shouldn't be completely dismissive of it. Likewise, the way a number of men or like the manosphere are completely dismissive of like feminism, or even in religious circles, completely dismissive of feminism and the feminist movement, when whether you like it or not, there are some good that have come out of it that Muslims have benefited from. So I just think that nuance and understanding, or like being, and like you mentioned, that person who is critical of some parts of it, but you can still take like what they think the good is from it.
I agree that actually it is one of the big strengths of figures like Jordan Peterson. Before, you know, he revealed like his political stances. The thing is, some of these guys are really clever because they're gonna inject some bits of truth, some elements that are completely valid, but the way it's tied together, this is where it raises questions. And I think a lot of when especially we talk about like Muslims in the UK who for many come from very challenging social and economic circumstances, I think there's a lot in the discourse that is very appealing because it's aspirational, it's motivational, and it is, it's about empowerment. So if you tell these things to people who for generations have been deprived from financial stability, media visibility, political representation, and who have grown up in households where there was not as much freedom, and in a society where in the mainstream the same young men, the young men are usually given a lot of freedom to explore whatever they want. So of course, I think this is something we talked about off camera. This is a kind of delayed adolescence that then kicks in that, oh, no, I can actually do these things. I can enjoy this lifestyle. It doesn't help, I think, that the whole society bombards us with images, whether it is in film, whether it is on social media, that this success means, having lots of money, having lots of women around, going on luxurious holidays, and so on and so on and so on. So I can understand the appeal of the discourse of the manosphere, but the sad thing is that many in that space promote these kind of messages for very selfish reasons, for making money out of vulnerable people. It's just a business, and it's just they're playing some kind of character on camera to get people's money, and then it raises the question. They're ready to, as long as it's sensational enough, controversial enough, they're ready to say things because it plays the game of the attention economy. And sadly, a lot of the people are not able to see that, and I think this is where it hurts really.
But the approach I'm seeing from a lot of like educators, like teachers, and like mothers or concerned wives, it's like it's all rubbish, and it's just like that's not. I don't think that's because even if you're dealing with a 13, 14-year-old, they've got a mind for themselves. To say that it's all complete rubbish when they themselves have benefited from the content, you can't be so dismissive of it because they've said some things about women, which again is problematic or you disagree with. So this is where, again, I just think that where they can see, okay, like you've come in from the research, from an intellectual perspective, you're talking about it, and so people can read and understand, okay, I see they're filling a vacuum and a valid, and whether you like it or not, there might be some parts, but they're not the devil incarnate. I think people need to understand, like critics of the manosphere, need to realise they are not, like, it's not all bad, but where the stuff that is problematic, maybe the person or people you think that are consuming that content, they might even just dismiss that. But just because you think because again, like you said, it's aspirational, and a lot of men, especially a lot of us, are goal orientated, and it's motivational. If they are providing more motivation and inspiration to be a better person, to perform than even like the imam, how can you say it's bad? And you're seeing the results, they're becoming more productive. Now, of course, obviously, if they're now, once they've got the power, they're now doing certain things, that's something else. But to all of a sudden just blame the manosphere, that's where I just think that, people need to, I mean, I know we didn't talk about this, but even like having an honest conversation, like why men seek out escorts and stuff like that. A lot of men are sexually deprived, they're sexually frustrated, they're in sexless marriages. I'm not justifying it, but there's a reason. It's not just they've been watching porn and they want to relive what they've seen. It's not everything that's so simplistic, and I just think having that nuanced conversation, but I think generally men can have that conversation with other men because we're not going to be so judgmental. Whereas I think when you're seeing it play out, like again, I'll speak to certain women or like mothers and stuff, it's just like porn's the blame because he's watching porn. So if he stop porn, then all of a sudden he's not going to be doing this, that, and that, or this bad imam or this red pill, and it's just like, it's not. And that's where I'm just thinking, how do we get those concerned people to have a more of a nuanced understanding, or when they're criticizing something, it's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, So because whether you like it or not, if you take that away, you need something to replace it. If people are feeling empowered, it's like someone telling me, don't listen to music. I mean, hip hop music, but there were some parts of hip hop music that I found as aspirational. There's some parts of hip hop music was educational for me more, and it connected for me to even learn more than when I was going to school. Do you understand what I mean? So that's why I just think, like, again, with your book, and because I think of educators, of course, because they're educate, so they'll appreciate the research and the concerned mothers and wives. And that's why I was trying to point to your book, something that they can read, because they need to take this information, but in not from just someone that's saying it's all bad. You're explaining the reason why. Do you understand my point? And that's why, again, I was trying to plug into your book, because the more women are always anti, the manosphere is the red pills, this and the other, the men are going to be more emboldened. Like, this is why the Matrix has got them. This is why we need to continue. And that's what I've seen, personally, I'll be honest with you, that a lot of guys, that because people will just make out like all of these figures are, everything they're saying is rubbish, they don't take them seriously. And that's why they can listen to these controversial figures, because they know some of what they're saying is element of truth, and what they're saying, which is like garbage, they'll just say, oh, it's satire, they're just joking. So they can make excuses for that because they're getting the benefit. But the critics, they're not saying, oh, although I don't agree with such and such, they are empowering men, they are encouraging men, they are teaching men to be more responsible. Do you understand? So they're not giving them any credit whatsoever. And when you do that, like I said, their fans or followers, what have you, will become even more like strong of a fan of that individual. That's what I've noticed. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got other questions.